You know, some bands just make great music. And then there are the other bands, the ones that end up defining an entire generation. Jefferson Airplane, they were definitely one of those. They weren't just a band, they were pretty much the sonic architects of the whole turbulent, psychedelic, and revolutionary 1960s. They were the sound of a counterculture finding its voice loud and clear. All right, let's get into it. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with how they basically invented the San Francisco sound. Then we'll look at their big psychedelic pivot, how they became the voice of a generation, what happened when the dream came crashing down, and finally, we'll talk about the complicated legacy they left behind. Everything kicks off in 1965. You've got this folk singer, Marty Balin, and he's getting kind of fed up with the mainstream. So he has this big idea. What if you could take the smart, thoughtful lyrics of folk music and fuse them with that raw, electric energy of bands like the Beatles coming over from Britain? To pull it off, he and his bandmates basically pioneered what we now call the San Francisco sound. And really, it wasn't just one thing. It was this wild mishmash of blues, folk, and these really early experimental electronic sounds. But the main ingredient? Freedom. Total freedom from the 3-minute pop song. They wanted to make long, sprawling, improvisational tracks that would completely change what you could hear on the radio. But, well, all that freedom came with a healthy dose of chaos. I mean, in the early days, the band's rhythm section was a total revolving door. Their original drummer, Jerry Peloquin, he quit because he couldn't stand their drug use. And that, right there, is a theme you're going to see pop up again and again. This was a group figuring out who they were right in front of everybody. Their first album, Jefferson Airplane Takes Off, is such a fascinating snapshot of this moment. It was still very much Marty Balin's band, this cool folk jazz record that was kind of a bridge between their folk roots and, well, everything that was about to happen. It was good, for sure, but it was really just a hint of the sonic explosion that was waiting right around the corner. And that explosion? It was triggered by one single change in the lineup. This is the moment the Airplane goes from being a cool local folk rock band to becoming international psychedelic superstars. So, late in 1966, singer Signe Anderson leaves to raise her family, and she's replaced by a former model with a voice that could just cut right through anything, Grace Slick. And wow, the change was instant. The band went from Marty Balin's smooth, ballad-heavy folk rock to Grace Slick's commanding psychedelic anthems that weren't just hinting at the counterculture, they were celebrating it loud and proud. And the result of that change was Surrealistic Pillow, pretty much the album of the Summer of Love. Here's a great little piece of trivia for you. Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead was so involved in shaping the album's sound, rearranging songs, adding guitar parts, that they actually credited him as their spiritual advisor. And get this, the album's 2 monster hits, Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, were both songs Grace Slick brought with her from her old band. Talk about making an entrance. Okay, we have to talk about White Rabbit. This song was a total game changer. Musically, it's basically a psychedelic bolero. It just builds and builds this incredible tension with a rhythm inspired by the classical composer Ravel, but lyrically, it was pure genius. By wrapping its message up in the familiar story of Alice in Wonderland, it basically smuggled one of the first openly pro-drug anthems right past the censors and onto mainstream radio. And it all comes down to that final command: feed your head. That wasn't just a lyric. It became a mantra for an entire generation. It was an open invitation to expand your consciousness and, question everything. Now, with all this new fame, the Airplane could have just kicked back and kept writing hits, but they didn't. Instead, they leaned in hard, ditching radio-friendly pop music for some truly radical experimentation and even more radical politics. This all came to a head with their 1969 album, Volunteers. I mean, this was a straight-up call to arms for the revolution. In the song We Can Be Together, they literally sang the activist slogan, "Up against the wall, motherfuckers." Think about that. That was a direct challenge to their own record label, RCA, and the government censors of the FCC. They had some serious guts. Their journey really mirrors the whole story of the 1960s counterculture, and you can see it perfectly in these 3 huge festivals. And here's the thing. They were the only band to play at all 3. Monterey Pop in '67 was their big national breakthrough. Woodstock in '69 was the absolute peak, the high point of the whole movement. And then just 4 months later, Altamont. That was the end, the brutal, violent end. So yeah, let's talk about the end of that dream. All that incredible optimism from Woodstock just curdled into something really dark and dangerous at a speedway in Northern California. It was billed as Woodstock West, but the Altamont free concert was just a total disaster from the start. The planning was terrible, and the, let's say, infamous decision to hire the Hells Angels biker gang for security created this toxic, violent atmosphere right from the get-go. This account really says it all. During the Airplane set, the Angels were beating a concertgoer with pool cues. So Marty Balin, the guy who started the band, jumps off stage to try and stop it. And for his trouble, he was immediately knocked unconscious by one of the bikers. Right there, the whole peace and love idea from Woodstock was literally beaten to death on stage. Altamont was the breaking point. That violence didn't just signal the end of the hippie dream. For the band, it just sped up all the cracks that were already forming. First, drummer Spencer Dryden was out. Then, a deeply shaken Marty Balin left not long after. The rest of the members started focusing on side projects like Hot Tuna and their own vanity record label, and by 1972, the original Jefferson Airplane was officially done. But the story doesn't just end there. Oh no. The band's DNA kind of splintered and reformed into all these new bands, creating a legacy that's both totally iconic and, let's be honest, a little confusing. Yeah, this evolution is something else. You've got the original revolutionary Jefferson Airplane. Then, in the 70s, you get Jefferson Starship, which had huge commercial success with a much slicker, mainstream rock sound. And then finally, in the 80s, it just becomes Starship, a corporate rock machine that gave us We Built This City, a song that even Grace Slick herself eventually said she hated. But history knows what's up. In 1996, it was that classic, surrealistic Pillow era lineup that got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That cemented their status not as a pop act, but as true, undeniable pioneers. And their musical influence? It's everywhere. You can hear it in Jack Cassidy's revolutionary lead bass style. I mean, he treated the bass like a second lead guitar. You hear it in Jorma Kaukonens' incredible blues fingerpicking, Paul Kontner's driving rhythm, and of course, in Grace Slick's powerful, precise vocals that just blew the doors open for generations of female rock singers to come. So in the end, they leave behind this kind of dual legacy. On one hand, they were absolute revolutionaries, this experimental, political, in-your-face voice of the counterculture. But on the other hand, they were also really savvy hip entrepreneurs. They were the first San Francisco band to sign with a major label, and they got really good at navigating that corporate world they were supposedly fighting against. Which, of course, brings us to the big question. Were Jefferson Airplane true revolutionaries who eventually just sold out their ideals for a bunch of money? Or were they just really smart entrepreneurs who succeeded so massively that they became part of the very establishment they once stood against? It's that tension right there that defined their whole career, and it's what makes their story so damn interesting.